Hey everybody, we're at about 4 after, so I think we will go ahead and get started with the combined working group meeting. The first topic that's up is one that I'm not familiar with about Forza. Is someone here who can speak to that?
Yes, that's me. I wrote an operator for managing sidecar upgrades and just managing the sidecars in general. And we've been using it where I work. I work for Cloudera. Basically, people were just saying, hey, you should contribute this back and open source it. And so I was curious if there's any interest in this sort of thing for inclusion into the Istio ecosystem, like the various, example stuff and the sail operator. And what questions do you have about it?
Can you give us an overview on it? Sorry.
Sure. So when you're running, for example, a canary and stable multiple revisions of Istio, and you go and update your control plane, for example, you'll also want your sidecars to be running the new version of the proxy associated with that. And to do that, you usually have to go through and restart all the workloads. So like a kube control rollout restart of the deployments, and figure out what's connected and make sure that everything restarts cleanly. So that was becoming very tedious. And so I started looking for a solution to automate it. I found that video that you had just clicked on about how they were doing things at Google, and they mentioned they had created an operator to handle it for them, but it's not open sourced. And so I started to work on creating something that did the same task. This can also be used eventually. I realized as we are beginning to convert to ambient, I realized I can also use it to restart the workloads to get rid of the sidecars. So during our conversion to ambient, so it can also be a tool for helping to convert to ambient. That's a very new revelation to me a couple days ago.
Well, as far as restarting sidecars goes, that definitely sounds like something that would be cool in the ecosystem. Certainly something that I think a few of us have built in the past internally, but never really shared publicly. So I could see some real value there. In terms of helping migration to ambient, that actually might be better than ecosystem. Tooling for assisting migrations is on our roadmap for this year. We have Jackie with us in the call, who's heading up that effort. And this is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a seasoned Golang programmer. I'm an operations engineer. And so, this is also sort of a call for anybody who's interested in it as a project to, take a look. And if you find that you want to participate and, help out with it, that's great. Patches are always welcome.
Keith, Lynn, I'm not familiar with the process for getting something moved into Istio ecosystem. Do you know?
Yeah, I think the process is relatively simple. Basically, you need approval from the TOC, if I remember correctly. And if the TOC member doesn't have objections, we could potentially create the repo for you and then make you the admin so you can move the contents yourself, because that's the easiest way to manage.
That sounds pretty cool.
Keith, I remember there are discussions around the ecosystem maintainers for voting for steering committee members, but I don't recall where the discussion ends. It may or may not relevant for you. Just so you know, you're not necessarily treated the same as a maintainer on the Istio project, but we are looking into potentially allow you to vote for like your steering committee member in the community. There's like 4 seats every year, so you could potentially vote for that if that's that process is formalized.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, cool project. Obviously it has value. Like I was at Google when people on this call had built it. So familiar with that problem space. For ambient, I will say, I think the harder part about migrating to ambient is not the restarting all the pods, which is also a one-time action.
Right.
And probably something you want to be very in control of and, you know, human in the loop. It's all the other stuff you have to do. So definitely cool stuff. If we want to do more around ambient, we probably need more than just restarting, right? That's kind of the easier part of ambient. So
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for now, this tool is, you know, as simple as possible to do that one targeted thing. Ultimately, what it enables us to do is manage Istio entirely using GitOps. So
Yeah, that's super cool.
yeah.
So, Stephen, since this requires TOC approval, we have an upcoming Technical Oversight Committee meeting this Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific, and I've added this to the agenda. I feel like the 4 of us that are here probably have enough context to act on it. If you're not able to make the meeting, or if you want to attend the meeting and speak to it there, you're welcome to do that as well.
Sure. Yeah, I will. I'll pick up the invite. I believe I have that time clear on my schedule now.
Awesome. Well, thank you for bringing this.
Yeah, that's great. One thing I would love to see, it's not super obvious to me, is as a user, how do I use this? And if you have any demo recording, I think I'm just thinking about how to expand your impact once it's landed in the ecosystem, right? If somebody else wants to use this, it's not obvious to me because I don't see a get started guide. I might be missing it. I think that will be really, really useful. Like, how do I invoke this? And do I scope it per namespace, or is it just per cluster? You know, what if I have 2 cluster? You know, those are the things people tends to ask.
Those are all good questions. And actually, I like your idea of getting a demo video. I've done a few demos at work. I don't know if I can share the videos we made of those, but I can certainly make another.
Yeah, that's so much appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Looking back at the agenda, next up is one I'm really sad to see on the agenda. Are our performance numbers not getting updated again?
Yeah, I added it on the agenda because I was actually a little bit surprised too. So I know Stephen from Microsoft has done a lot of work. I believe the 124 number were produced by Stephen. I could be wrong though. I believe prior to 124, some of the sidecar numbers were produced by one of our interns. So I wonder if we should do a rotation on this or somehow to get it rolling. Keith.
Yeah, I was going to ask on the process for this, like, is if we expect these numbers to be updated each release, we should probably make it a release blocker, because this is there is a gap between I think 119 where the numbers are frozen for 119 or 116, I can't remember, but we can't just like depend on people to find the time to do it if we don't directly assign it to somebody. It could be the secondary release manager's job. It could be, there are different things we can do, but if we want this to be an if we do expect to make sure this is happening, it needs to be a release blocker.
I think these honestly aren't even mentioned in the release checklist.
So
Yeah.
I know that we've had it work to automate these in the past, and I think at least for some period of time they were automated. The Intel team did a good deal of that work before they left the project. But unfortunately, one of the things that tends to happen is if there's something automated that none of us are watching and it breaks, no one notices for a year or two. And that has happened before with regard to the performance tests, and I'm guessing that that has happened now as well.
So my understanding is it's never like fully automated. Somebody has to kick off the test and then collect the result. I do think it's mostly automated though. So with enough sufficient instructions, I like Keith's idea. Maybe we could tie this to the release manager so we can rotate out through the community because we're asking individual contributor or companies to sign up for release managers, assuming release managers can pick up this work easily. John.
Yeah, unless I'm out of the loop, there's two different tests. Well, actually, there's three different tests. There's the micro benchmarks, which is like the latency stuff. There's the wide scale data plane stuff, which is this number here, 70,000 mesh write requests per second, which is probably not super useful, but exists. And then there's a third thing, which is I think what we're talking about here, which is the control plane performance, which there does not exist a test that we have for it. I mean, I test the control plane performance a lot because I work on it and I have my own tests that I run, but we don't have like a standardized one that anyone can just go and run and we compare that consistently release to release, you know?
Are any of the suites that you're referring to the same as the like quote unquote long running tests?
Yeah, so what happened was before we had this thing called the long running test, and we used to report the control plane performance there, and then this line here that says 1,000 services, 70,000 mesh requests per second. We stopped reporting the control plane performance because it wasn't actually updated for like since 1.0, and the number was way off. If you run the long running test, the CPU of Istio D is like 1% or something tiny. The problem is that back when we made the test, that used to like destroy Istio. It was using like 10 CPUs and it was a good stress test. But now it's like chump change for Istio. It's not a problem at all. So it's, as we've improved the performance, we have to improve our tests, but we never changed the tests. So we stopped reporting the results because the result was total BS.
We're missing those latency test numbers down below too, though, right?
That I'm not sure. I mean, it says right there, latency for 124. Oh, it's 126 now.
124, right. So maybe
First meeting
John,
back.
if you think the control plane test was not useful, maybe we can remove it because the thing I think people mostly interested in the data plane performance, and the graph shows the latency comparison. So we can minimize the work. And I do believe Stephen did collect that data in probably in 124.
Yeah, I would go one step further and just say we should take exactly what John just said and put a summarized version of that in the control plane performance section. Like, I think that is useful to say, like, how much am I going to pay in CPU by running STOD in a large mesh, and like giving general performance behavior would be right. And then say if you see numbers above XYZ, open an issue. I think that's relatively. I think that's what people are going to be looking for. On the latency numbers, yeah, I think just go back to my earlier point about making sure that it's a blocker of some sort or documented in some process. But to Lynn's point, I don't think there's anything stopping people from doing it. It's just not on people's mind.
So do we believe release manager could potentially pick up this work? Maybe it will be a good job for a secondary release manager for the release. And it's only as part of the term, I think one person only need to run it one time. Also, can we ask, I don't see Stephen on the call, can we ask Stephen to maybe update the doc? Because I think I ran it a while back, like a year or two ago. The doc is probably needs a refresh, just making sure other people can run it and have access to the environments.
Yeah, Steven's traveling today, but I can follow up with him internally and see what his bandwidth looks like.
All right, so sounds like we have a tentative plan for this to get it rolling for the next release.
All right.
Should we just maybe sync on this topic in a couple of weeks?
Sounds good.
So we're saying we're not going to do a control plane test, or
Yeah, because I think he said add some verbiage, which I think makes sense. I mean, I don't know how to do the control plane. I think Stephen ran the data plane, so I know it's relatively simple to do. The control plane, I think you said it's not that usable. Am I hearing correctly?
I mean, there is no standardized control plane test. So there was maybe I mean, it depends I would say there's no standardized control plane test. There is a data plane test that you can look at what the control plane is doing, but it's not useful. We could build a standardized control plane test and then report the results. We don't do that today. So, and I'm fine not doing it. I'm fine doing it. The problem with them generally is that people want to go say, I have 10,000 pods. What's the CPU going to be? But you really need them to tell us, I have, these 100 variables, and it's not really a way to do that. So
yeah, I think if we get enough people over time, if we add the verbiage and people end up coming to us and saying, there's a scenario where where the control plane isn't performing well, or we have some sort of progression, then I think we should introduce it back. But yeah, I think I get everything else John said.
Yeah, if we have bandwidth, I'm happy to reintroduce, but I think focus on restore the data plane first for now. I think makes sense.
All right. Let's have a look at what's next on the agenda then. Looks like we have a conversation about our authorization API for L7 from Andrew.
Yeah, so, and John, I'm sorry, it's going to feel like Groundhog Day because you answered my question on this in the channel yesterday. I thought I'd just prompt a discussion. Was using waypoints, and rather than the default waypoint for services, where waypoints just capture traffic destined for a service, I had it set to for all, so it's capturing traffic destined for workloads as well. And then I realized when doing that, there's no way for me to scope an authorization policy that controls that traffic. So for example, if I have traffic destined for a pod and it's captured by a waypoint, I can't say traffic going through that waypoint to this pod should have the following authorization policy. I could say traffic through that waypoint has this authorization policy, but that's all traffic through the waypoint. I can't scope it down to the pod specifically. And so I wasn't sure if it was like there's some cumbersome reason why it can't be done, or if it just hasn't been done yet because nobody needed it, or where it stood. But I figured I'd kind of nudge that discussion. Yeah, go for it, Keith.
John, correct me if I'm wrong, or anybody else who's thought about this, but if I understand correctly, this is purely an API limitation of target ref and not a technical limitation.
I can give the history behind this. So we used to actually do it this way, and how we had, so in the sidecar world, there's really like two proxies on the path, right? There's like the client side stuff and the server side stuff. And what we did originally was we just took that model and we shoved it into one process. And we kind of said there's two steps of Envoy processing where we literally loop back through Envoy again internally And the first one, we do all the things that used to be on the client side. So it's like load balancing, routing, header manipulation, whatever. And then on the second loop through, we do what used to be on the server side, which was the like authorization policies and telemetry. And if you were doing traffic that was to workload, you would only hit the second half of that. And then you could have authorization policies that target the workloads by label selector, and we would apply them there. We changed that model for quite a few reasons. One, we kind of moved to a model where the waypoint's more service oriented, and like you attach policy to a service, like authorization policy to a service, and then we ensure like the traffic goes through there. And the other thing is like the way we did it was terrible. Like in Envoy, even we had to like loop back to ourselves, and there's no gateway like really out there that can do authorization. Like there's no like two-step processing on any gateways. Envoy happens to allow us to send back to ourselves, but it's really wonky, really costly, and just kind of weird. So that's kind of the high level. I'm sure there's more reasons that I'm forgetting now, but that's kind of the history of why we don't do it. Yeah. There was also some stuff about like before we were trying to ensure that if you said you have a workload waypoint, the traffic must go through there. And so what we do is if you got to the destination without hitting the waypoint somehow, we would hairpin that back to the waypoint. And this caused all sorts of wonkiness and problems. So we also got rid of that and said, no, we don't guarantee the traffic goes through the waypoint. That's up to the client, and the server side should enforce if it wants to, traffic must come from the waypoint.
I think the other, just a little bit more context. Since we had ztunnel, and ztunnel was able to do authorization policy at L4, which was workload attached, the use cases for doing what you're talking about here, Andrew, the assumption, right, like so the infrastructural cases where you want to address the workload, but you don't want to go through a service, right? They're typically like the one you're showing here, like Prometheus. And so you don't necessarily need it at L7, right? L4 policy was probably going to be sufficient to say, allow Prometheus to call the workload, right? Because you trusted Prometheus not to call everything that the workload would expose. Maybe the health endpoint is on a specific port, so L4 was sufficient to enforce the policy necessary to make this use case work.
Yeah, I think when it came up for discussion, is the obvious kind of thing that we could do on our side that's completely under control right now is just send it. If we made the waypoint just capturing service, and then we made a ztunnel bound policy. And there was the argument that you don't get quite as fine-grained control. You know, I can't say quite as specifically what Prometheus is allowed to access, but I mean, I get it too, that it's already a bit of an edge case, so maybe it's just not worth the extra effort of catering towards it.
Is what you need a L7 policy, like a L7 targeted workload policy, or is it the fact that you have another L7 policy that doesn't allow for Prometheus, and so you need another policy? I'm trying to understand the specific API.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. So like I think the common way, or maybe the only way that Prometheus would be scraping something like something that had multiple pods backing it would be that Prometheus discovers all the pods specifically and then scrapes each one of them individually. So it's not going through a service and being, round robined out. It can go to each one individually. And so then, of course, you're doing direct communication as opposed to going through the service. And in that case, if you have a waypoint that is serving that namespace, say, and it's capturing workload traffic, like it's got that waypoint 4 as all or as workload, then it's going to get in the middle and you can't use an L4 policy anymore.
You can't use an L4 policy.
Right, so
I couldn't use it. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. Well, then the question, Andrew, is like, what is the segregation that you want in terms of policy attachment, right? So let's say Prometheus is always now going through the waypoint. Any L7 waypoint attached policy will affect all Prometheus traffic. What level of granularity of control is insufficient there?
Yeah. So you're right that I could bind something to the waypoint. So I could have, say, surface account Prometheus is allowed to pass through and bind that to the waypoint. But then we're talking about all traffic going through the waypoint. So it's allowing Prometheus to reach anybody that waypoint services.
Though you can obviously use traffic rules to restrict the set of addressed hosts and services, right?
Could you do it for service? Well, so it's not going for a service. It's just going straight to a pod IP.
Right, but you could use the authorization policy to deny a host name, right?
Yeah. So if I'm maybe I'm just not recalling how this works correctly, but if I'm saying in the authorization policy, I'm saying you are allowed to reach this host name. Is that going to work for Prometheus, which is just, effectively curling a pod IP? Like, I think the only way that would work is if I'm saying, Prometheus, you're only allowed to access this particular IP. And so then I've got to live update my IPs if there's ever churn.
Yeah, so this is kind of the decision point about whether you want it to be treated as L4 or L7. Right, authorization policy will let you reason about anything in the traffic. So yes, you could deny based on IPs. Obviously, that's not very maintainable, as you say. If it's directly addressing IPs, it's not addressing services. So there's not a lot of value in capturing to workload in that case, right? That would be generally the recommendation, is don't capture to workload for that scenario.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess maybe, so I agree with you that probably what I would do in the case I currently face is no longer capture the workload and then make a Z-tunnel bound policy that lets Prometheus scrape these things. But then I'm not sure I see why a waypoint can capture to workload in the first place, if then you can't do things like actually enforce policy going to those things.
You can, it's just they have to be things that are visible in the traffic, not visible by policy attachment to the labels of the workload. That is the distinction. Right, so if I want to say, okay, it's directly addressing workload traffic, there's no host header, it's just the IP address.
Mm-hmm.
But there are API calls, paths, headers, other properties of the traffic, plus the source principal that I want to control on, and I can do that. Right, so you still have that value.
Okay, so you'd be saying something like Prometheus is allowed to get /metrics for everything behind this waypoint. That would still be of value.
Yeah. The one gap today, and it's one that in theory we could address, but we haven't. Right, we have this principle now that authorization policy is only really based on things that are in the traffic. Right, there's obviously the binding mechanism, but then the policy itself expresses properties against the traffic. One thing that's actually technically in the traffic is the destination identity.
Mm-hmm.
Right, separate from the destination IP. We could actually, over time, add support for destination principle into authorization policy. It would require a little bit of work to make it work, but it wouldn't require the loop back thing that John described, which is the real big headache in Envoy.
Yeah.
Right? That's the unmaintainable thing, frankly.
So you're saying like targeting a destination identity in authorization policy? That's what you mean, Louis?
Yeah, so you could say destination principle and create a condition on it. And then when the traffic flowed through down into the cluster in Envoy, you would check what the negotiated principle was for the endpoint, and you could accept or deny the traffic at that point. It's a little bit funny, right? We'd have to look at the kind of composition in the filter chain, but it is logically something in the traffic and therefore something that could be enforced.
Yeah, but RBAC is on listener, not on cluster.
Yeah. So it has to carry the context through, right? So it has to kind of get attached to the call, propagate down through the filter chain. When it gets into the cluster, there has to be a check there, right?
No,
So
but this destination rule is going to split the traffic to can split traffic to different identities based on the cluster.
yeah,
space.
no. So it's not perfect, right? Because you can have mixed identities in a service, for instance.
But really, the problem is, again, that will be a weird thing that nobody else is doing it. So it's going to be, I mean, it's not something that it's typically done. So better not to be too original with something that is.
Yeah, no. Right. There's a reason why.
Necessary.
There's a reason why we didn't put it in. It's because it would be quite novel.
No, but like actually, I mean, to this point, it's actually something we had been looked at. Like we looked at like maybe one of the authorization policies also supports identity to identity as opposed to identity to, you know, a group of workloads or labels or whatever it is right now. So, yeah, I mean, it's slightly off discussion, but like I do think there might be some value in it to support.
Value, there is value, there is cost. The problem is that the cost is far higher than the value. So everything can have a value, but and have some use cases, but the cost in complexity and the cost in overhead and the cost on making things complicated and unnatural and incompatible with any other server is far outweighing this.
Yeah, I would generally agree with Costin here. We already have the implicit, right, L4 to destination identity, right? And the fact that services don't have identities, right, in Kubernetes or in most systems, that you can kind of infer them, but it's not accurate and it's unusual. So I don't think we want to be that novel. So like concretely for Andrew here, like the recommendation is either bypass and don't capture, right? That would be the first recommendation, because then you get, right, and particularly for Prometheus, you generally don't need to control it all that much, right? Because you trust it with shared infrastructure. It's not going to go awry unless, you know, you're worried about a lateral movement attack where Prometheus is hacked and therefore used to attack every workload. Even there, right, you should probably make sure that Prometheus is scraping a well-known port. That well-known port is not shared with an API port on the same application. That would generally be a bad practice. Just things like that.
Yeah, makes sense.
Anyway, my suggestion was which I put it on the chat is that you know, at least in Kubernetes and in many cases, it's super easy to create a new service name, to attach the port, and then it becomes part of the traffic because it'll be a part of FQDN. So it's natural, it's simple, it's clean, it's you know, why make things complicated when it can be very simple?
Well, I think in the case of something like Prometheus, it needs to be hitting each pod individually.
Yeah, you could kind of treat it as headless, but even then, that's a bit weird.
Yeah,
like
the headless actually gets captured by the waypoint, like the waypoint capturing workload. So I think it's still we'd still have to treat it the same way.
So stateful sets are very special because, I mean, the session affinity is the thing we discussed last time about the inference pools and a lot of other things, where you want to target a very specific IP. That's special. I mean, it's not the same thing with a regular use case for load balancers, and having a dedicated port, dedicated service name associated with this case is also a very good idea, because again, you can set policies in that based on the traffic, based on the host header, and then you may have some way to pass the identity of the port. For example, you could put the encoded, I don't know, it's a hack to put the encoded IP address of the, you know, that we use for cookies, and that will work perfectly fine with the current waypoints. I don't know if you want to go that hacky way, but if you just declare that it has session affinity on that particular new service, and you manually encode the IP port, nobody will know that you know, it's and it's all part of the traffic.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, I've got options. Cool, thank you.
Is it Mitch's screen? Mitch is still here?
He's here, just muted.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, maybe.
sorry, I'm talking to you all on mute. Lior, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is last meeting we didn't have enough presence to actually, I mean, generally like the feedback to actually critique even more. The meeting before the last one, we kind of talked a little bit about a few options that we have, and we finished the meeting by actually saying that we might benefit from, enhancing destination rule and supporting it through there. I think in general after that, and also like in different chats with John, also in the group chat, I think where I'm going right now, there's also this thread on GitHub between Louis, John, Rob. I think Rob should be here as well. Yeah, I think there is a so to echo some of the things, but there is a mismatch right now, right? Like destination rules per cluster, whatever we're doing with inference is it's per route. This is how it is configured now. This is also how xproc per route is going to be configured. We cannot use xproc per cluster. So therefore destination rule feels a little bit like a mismatch for doing it. That said, we could theoretically on destination rule, like basically finding the cluster and then finding all the routes and referencing this cluster and enhancing it with the LoRa aware load balancing. So I guess I'll start from the end. I mean, I think most people have already the context. I think maybe we could reach to a state where we support basically option 3 in this doc, like support some kind of like carrying out config internally, like basically reconciling inference pool, carrying out config and doing it in the first iteration of this implementation, and potentially work towards like some of Costin's comment and to see whether we want to support this new generic not generic but like xproc load balancer basically, whether it should be on the destination rule level, which means like no matter how the traffic got to this service, just enhance it with a LoRa word balancing, or like it could be used for many other different cases for selecting an endpoint. But I think just at this point it's very hard to converge because there are so many. I mean, during the last meeting, there's so many different use cases that were brought up that are related. Yes, so that's basically trying to kind of give a very short summary. And yeah. So is there anyone, I mean, I know a lot, Louis, I know you have some opinions about the general API, but is there anyone in the call objects to actually progressing with, supporting this API in a way where similar like to what we're doing right now, but just like a little bit more organized, which is, option 3 here, carrying some, config.config with extra info or something else, and basically doing, providing the support like this. And then in parallel, actually seeing if we want to support a new public API or capability in Istio to provide either specifically this, LoRa aware balancing policy, or a more generic way of, supporting this xproc endpoint picking for whatever reason.
John and I haven't had a ton of time to talk about the options, so I don't know if John, you've been out, so I don't know what your current thinking is about this. Obviously, option 2 was the kind of more immediately obvious Istio idiomatic way of doing it.
Sorry, 1 second. Let me pull the doc so I have the. Yeah, I just feel like why make a public API if we don't expect users to use it, right? So I guess my question is, do we expect users to use it? It wasn't clear. Like when I talked to Lior, we had kind of said, we don't expect users to use xproc to pick an endpoint outside of inference where it's an implementation detail.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I
Well,
don't.
I wouldn't say like we don't have enough load balancing flexibility.
Okay,
is
let
probably what I would say.
me phrase things ever so slightly differently. If we are going to make a new public user-facing API, we would rather, especially one that doesn't have people hounding on our door to do it, right? I've never actually heard anyone request this. We ought to do it like the right way, right? Is there anyone that thinks it's correct to be on route and listener rather than on the cluster? Ignoring what Envoy does, just logically. Keith?
Let me toss your question back at you. You're asking are you asking about xproc generally or xproc for endpoint selection? I don't know if you see those
Making, oh yeah. So if we're making xproc as a thing, that's different. I'm talking about endpoint selection.
Okay, so specifically load balancing via xproc, that particular use case.
Or just load balancing in general as an extensible mechanism, right? So let's not bind ourselves necessarily to xproc, which is kind of an implementation detail of a look-aside load balancer. Do we think we want general purpose support for look-aside load balancers in the API, or in a way to allow for plug-in or extensible load balancer selection?
So yeah, and like while I agree, like very much agree that like attaching it to a service provide much better UX than attaching it to a route. Like an Envoy service, like an Envoy cluster. What I mean, I do think that there may be. I think there's already are some implementations that actually needs to route between two different Envoy clusters, like on the route level. I mean, there were some talks in the AI day that even do it like, between clouds, which like, kind of go beyond some of the mesh capabilities. But like, I do anticipate there may be in the future some cases where they want to do this load balancing. And then what the xproc is returning is not necessarily an endpoint, but more of like, okay, maybe an FQDN of a service, or maybe something that's a higher level than an Envoy cluster. Does that make sense?
Well, so like Envoy has composite cluster. Do you treat that as a routing problem, or you just treat that as a load balancing problem? Right. Like,
I question
where's the logical? Yeah. What is the logical separation there?
I question what the API looks like there. Like inference pool today selects pods. So what does it mean to be multi-cloud?
Right.
No, so I'm not saying multi-cloud, but I'm saying like right now, for example, one of the AI Day talks from, I think, what was it? Not Broadcom, for Bloomberg is like, they want to first, so they're using this AI gateway, right? But they first want to select the specific cloud it hosts their model, right? And then within the cloud, they are selecting the specific endpoint for their services. But like, I think if we're going beyond that, so let's assume I have a few services, different services, like for different models. And then let's say I have an endpoint picker that's right now is actually not only selected the best pod to we're talking about xproc, right? So like I have a use case where I don't only select the best pod to route within a model, within a specific model. I actually select the right model based on some payload I pass to the xproc. So while I do think it's very much like for the current use cases that I see, the more use cases I see right now is like it's very much preferable, in my opinion, to have it attached only for an Envoy cluster, because it's just not a routing concept. I do think that like if we want to do load balancing in general, xproc based load balancing, I do think we may see use cases like this in the future where people just develop an xproc and they want the xproc to just do routing to different services or something like that, which is dynamic. Yeah,
I was going to say that last question the last thing you said, Lior, I think is going to be important for discussing this, because I think we need to distinguish between load balancing versus routing. And that's going to inform what I think John's API question is, right? So load balancing is the selection of a particular endpoint The AI inference use case makes that sort of somewhat difficult because, as I understand it, it's sort of all in one. There can be a route that selects different inference pools, but those inference pools, well, no, inference pool selects pods, so those should be separate clusters. So I still see that as a routing question. Do you want to allow XProc for routing? XProc for load balancing, which is selection of a specific pod within within the pool, that is a different story. And I'm not sure where John's landing on this, but I see some concerns with XProc as a load balancing question, because that does feel like it belongs on the cluster, and there needs to be some pluggable cluster load balancing policy within Envoy.
But to be clear, 1 second, Keith, and to be clear, right now, what inference pool is doing, like what Gateway API inference extension is doing, and I think, I mean, Rob, feel free to jump in if you have opinions. It's load balancing. It's not routing. I mean, it's on the route level, but it is doing load balancing, and that's also kind of related to some of the concerns Louis also pointed out on. But what I'm saying, because the endpoint picker is a little bit, and this differentiation you laid out, it's really good, but like the endpoint picker is a pluggable thing. I can develop an endpoint picker today, which selects the best service, and within the best service, it selects the best endpoint, for example. So then how do you call it? Do you call it load balancing? Because it's a load balancing across multiple services. You know what I mean? Like you could tell me, yo, that's an anti-pattern, and I'll be fine with that. I'm just, trying to think a little bit about like creativity that can be added here. And we can also say, okay, this is not supported. Like this is fine.
Right, but Lior, in that case, like the between multiple services, the services are implementation details, right? As far as the consumer is concerned, there's still one service being addressed, right?
Yes, or an inference pools set.
Right.
I mean, just as an example.
Right. So if we have to be very like, and you could obviously compose these two things, right? We could have, right? It's no longer endpoint picker; it's also a router,
right?
And is the concept of service even meaningful, right? In the kind of API compositional sense at that point, right? So I have like addressable service, but called by the client. Really, the internal implementation detail of that is 3 different services or inference pools, which are basically the same thing. You have some routing mechanism to choose between them. You're saying that routing mechanism can also choose the endpoint within them. So it is both a router and a load balancer all in one, because you don't want to make 2 endpoint picker calls for latency reasons or for other reasons. And so basically, the whole routing and endpoint selection / load balancing stack is delegated.
Yeah, which I'm saying it could be a use case. Right now, it's just load balancing. To clarify.
Yeah, no, I agree. Right, like we can flatten it, at which point it does become a routing concept. The question is, in the case where that's not happening, do we need to maintain some of the semantics of load balancing, particularly in the fallback case, right, where the endpoint picker fails in the system, right? So what are the acceptable failure modes? Because if the assumption is, look, the endpoint picker is down, but because I know the service, I can fall back to least loaded or round robin or something else within the basic service requirements, that the system will continue to function.
Yeah, I mean, right now, the way I think it's, definitely. I think we should maintain this. So, Rob, do you have different opinions here? I know we are supporting fallbacks also from the endpoint picking, but if the endpoint picker is not available, then
no, that's right. We have 2 modes that are supported by inference pool. One is fail open, one's fail closed. It really depends on how highly available your endpoint picker is. I hope that the failure mode is not something that is a common case, but when it is, we've defined that behavior as being implementation specific. Even if we were using service here, the kinds of capabilities that you would want to use on something like Istio, like least loaded, they're not in the service API. So I think relying on whatever an implementation thinks is best is probably fine here for what I hope will be an edge case.
Right, but in the case where the endpoint picker is acting as a router, right, you can't have fail open behavior, right, because the system's incapable of routing.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we've been entirely focused on endpoint picker as a load balancing solution, not a router.
Yeah.
Right, so we need to know if we need to expand the scope, I guess, is the question, because that will have a really radical effect on the API.
I would say my understanding of the trajectory of endpoint picker and the inference project is it will forever be load balancing only. And load balance, it will be forever about endpoint selection. I have no awareness of any plans to try and add routing to the scope, because that would be very
No, the question
very
is
troubling for everyone.
the question is whether it would be, I mean, maybe it's a deferred question as well, but like it's important to understand that the question whether it will forever be endpoint selection, but whether it would be endpoint selection across only one service essentially, or can it select endpoint across multiple different models, like in the future where people host different models and they want a very, very smart endpoint picking with the output.
Right.
Yeah.
An inference pool itself is a group of pods that, and basically it means that the endpoint picker is selecting the best pod, the best endpoint from within that.
Okay, that's fine.
So
Well,
that, initially we, and I think we still have this requirement, or no, I don't think it's even, there's no way to enforce this requirement, but the suggestion that every pod within an inference pool should have the same base model. It's possible that as more endpoint pickers emerge, there are ones that support more a higher variety of endpoints.
Right, even where the endpoints, the inference pool has no label selector at all, right? It's fully virtualized.
That is an interesting. I definitely want inference pool to be able to expand across clusters, being able to expand beyond Kubernetes at all, which it might be where you were going with that. I'm not sure.
If the complexity of the endpoint selection is really a kind of internal implementation detail of XProc, right? And people are controlling that with code. Completely, they don't need label selection, basically, right? Because their code has to have all that logic anyway. It might be convenient to say this is the end that you pick one out of, but they probably already know that most of the time.
Yeah,
So
that's fair.
The generic problem, as we discussed in the first part of the meeting, remains, the waypoint gateway picking a very specific IP address, be it the Prometheus one, inference pool, or whatever use case it is. It doesn't really matter if it's in the same Kubernetes cluster, it has label, it's a VM, it's something completely different. What is important is that we have a way to specify the IP port where the request will go, making sure, of course, the security characteristics are respected. I mean, we still check the identity of the destination, but it has nothing to do with inference, nothing to do with Kubernetes. It's a very generic problem for any proxy to be able to do that. So my concern is to not diverge too much into models or whatever inference specific use cases, but to solve the generic problem for Prometheus and for everything else, for sessions and for everything else.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, but John, did you have anything else? Because we kind of took the thing to a different place.
I don't know that I necessarily have anything else, but I don't know that for you that you got an answer that you were looking for. Did you? I didn't need anything out of this discussion other than to unblock you. So.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, I wanna also let Keith talk, but theoretically, I would very much. We have 2 minutes. I would very much wanna go with something we could move forward as opposed to waiting to next week as well. Yeah, can we do any gradual approach to go over this? Like, yeah, what's your opinion? And Keith?
In my mind, I don't have a ton of opposition to option 3, just sort of what's it called? Decorating, that's what I'm looking for. Decorating config with extra info. with labels. I don't have a huge opposition to that in the short term. I do think that we need to decide this API question because I definitely understand the tension that John called out initially, that if we were designing this from scratch and doing of API details, you probably want this as a load balancing algorithm on the cluster in Envoy. But today, xproc doesn't have that sort of flexibility because the host could be you could choose a cluster with xproc, so it sort of lives on route today. So we need to figure out what we want to do for that API, and then sort of following from that, I think we need to have a discussion on what do we want, what xproc functionality do we want in Istio generally. John has a good list of things we probably want. This should probably fit into that, maybe, or maybe it doesn't as a generic API. But those are the questions I have for follow-up conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Louis, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about the latter part. Like we can figure out how to make the declare the xproc service, right? I'm not too worried about that side of the house. Yeah, I'm really just worried about the attachment. I can see how to do it both ways. We don't have to create an API yet, but we'll be creating an API some way or other anyway. Like if we say we're going to use annotations or labels, right? That's an API.
No, I mean, that's an internal annotations or labels. Like it's right now we're just manipulating Istio HTTP route names because we don't have annotation labels. Like we have a virtual service, right? Like when you convert and you say, convert it from gateway or something. So we could do it like fully internally without exposing any API until,
I
the
see what you
discussions
mean.
come. Yeah.
So basically just infer all the semantics from inference pool and do it automatically.
Yes.
And just have some way to bind to some Istio understood definition of what an xproc was and how it could be referenced. So
yeah,
how is the xproc implementation referenced in that world?
right now it's today, like you just shove it in. So you look at inference pool, and then from the inference pool you have this reference to this picker, right, which is the xproc, whatever. And then you just shove it in the right now I'm shoving it in like Istio HTTP because it's per route, right? So you have a route, so we shove it in the name, but theoretically if I do this route with xrainfo, I just can get it out of there. And then when I convert it to XDS, I'm just like, adding the xproc routes there.
How does the inference pool reference the xproc?
Oh, in the API itself, you have an extension ref field.
Right, but is it referencing a service? What is it referencing?
I mean, I think I think it's a service endpoint.
Yeah, it's a service. Yeah.
Theoretically, it should support FQD. Like you're right. I'm not sure if it supports external services. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same backend ref on HTTP route. It's copy paste.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Right. So Istio could use service entry for it if it wanted to.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so that would solve for inference pool, but it wouldn't solve for anybody other use case.
Right. So then that's where I want to get like more use cases, and some of Costin's use cases and things were brought up, but because John's making a good point, like he did not hear any use case, at least from the the community, about having endpoint picking endpoint picking for something else other than inference. So there's this question whether we actually want to think about what people would want and then design an API, or want to lurk and see, or maybe have existing use cases to try and develop for them to also make it generic. That's some of the things that's a little bit uncertain in my side.
Right. So we've seen affinity requests before, right? Where people have like high cache coherency, like Gmail is maybe the classical case study of this because they've actually talked about it publicly, right? Where based on the user identity, they route to a very specific instance of the backend, right, to get very, very high cache coherence or cache locality effects for reads. Because it's so material to the performance of the system. So you can kind of just generalize that any request like that can benefit from an endpoint picking solution.
Okay.
Right. Stateful systems, semi-stateful systems, right? Right.
Okay.
That's quite common.
Well,
and it's
okay,
very
yeah.
hard for us to write the logic, right? Like based purely on, you know, the capabilities of HTTP route, right? Like maybe you have to process a cookie, extract some field out of it, do some stuff, right? To actually know where you want to go. That's, you know, in bigger systems, that's not uncommon.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then there's the general purpose look-aside load balancer, right? Where, right, Envoy is okay in it, you know, it's algorithmic local understanding of the traffic that passes through it, but it doesn't have a global view of the world. And so any load balancer system that has a global view of the world would have to be integrated that way as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Or
Sounds
at least,
good. I mean,
yeah.
no, that's fine. What I'm about to say, I mean, this is good feedback. Either like I think that the way I see it right now is like, you know, regardless of this current implementation of inference pool, I'm saying like if we want to do it per service and actually doing load balancing, you know, load balancing and endpoint picking, you know, destination rule, as we said in the previous meeting, is a good place. But the way I see it right now, just correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to start this parallel threads, right? Like working on inference pool, but also working on generalizing it. It's probably going to be like looking up for, you know, if it's in destination rule, so looking up for currently with Envoy all the routes it's referenced in this pool, right? Because of the limitation of Envoy, unless you had something else in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind necessarily doing this per route. Like even destination rule has that limitation, right? Where it wants to attach to something, and those things are places where the endpoints are well known and predefined, which is not actually a concrete requirement, right? It may in the long run actually be an anti-pattern, right? Because you might want to purely virtualize the definition. And the service definition is literally just a placeholder for addressing and the creation of the VIP.
Yeah.
Right. The actual endpoint mapping is maintained somewhere else entirely.
Yeah.
So those are real use cases. They're not super common, but they are common in bigger systems.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, I appreciate everyone's feedback. And yeah, I'm not feeling equipped to call this meeting by an end, but if there's someone with more authority here who wants to do it.
So if the most general solution is attaching to route, I'm fine with that. We don't have to attach, at least initially, to service. We can always add attachment to service as a refinement or a UX improvement later, but I'd rather do the most useful thing first. Unfortunately, I do have to drop as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
I'll follow up. Bye.